to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews like the one you're going to watch today. I am delighted to be joined by not just one guest, but two, and I'll have them introduce themselves in just a moment. But what I will say before we start the conversation, I'll remind you of a couple of previous interviews that I did that I think have relevance to the topic. And I'll also mention this at the end, but I'll go ahead and plug it now. I have a really exciting interview coming up on Thursday night this week with Dr. Liz Jackson on her paper titled Wagering Against Divine Hiddenness. And it's about how Pascal's wager explains the hiddenness of God. So I think you'll find that interesting. I spend a lot of time on my channel focusing on Pascal's wager. So make sure you, when this video's done, go and look at that one. It's the next in the list of my upcoming videos. And you can click the little bell icon to get a reminder. So a couple of previous interviews that I want to remind you of before this one is my interview with Dr. Terrence Cuneo. I believe he works at the University of Vermont. We talked about whether or not there are moral facts at all. And we spent a lot of time talking about error theory and moral nihilism. So check that interview out. I think you'll find it helpful. And we're going to talk about the specific facts today. But that was a helpful dialogue. Also, I had an interview with Dr. Matthew Flanagan maybe 2 weeks ago now about divine command theory, where God can kind of begin to play into at least one facet of morality, and that's our obligations. So, and we even had a little discussion at the end with Dr. Flanagan about the relationship between not just obligations, but God and goodness. And so check those interviews out. All right, without further ado, let's jump into today's topic. So I will go ahead and pull up my two guests, and I will let you all introduce yourselves. Let me take myself out. All right, and take away my label and put up yours. All right, will you introduce yourselves?
Go ahead first.
Sure. I'm Mary Beth Baggett. I teach English at Liberty University. Oh, no, that's her. And I teach philosophy there and apologetics. I'm Dave Baggett. And we're going to talk about abductive moral argument today that I've worked on. And in one version, Mary Beth and I worked on it together in a book called The Morals of the Story. And so, yeah, that's why we're here together today.
Will you hold that book up really quick?
Oh, yeah. So this is my, there you go. Can you see that? And
Perfect, thanks.
This is my 14th year at Liberty. I think this is your 17th?
17th.
Yeah. And so we're pleased to be here today, and it's nice to meet you finally, virtually, Jordan.
Yeah. What the viewers may not know is that I've had an ongoing conversation with Dave in in email, and my family's been super sick, and he's been really kind enough to reschedule and just been really gracious throughout the whole process. So I'm appreciative of that. So before talking about the book, maybe you can tell me just a little bit about your background, both of you, how you're interested in philosophy, like how that started, and Mary Beth, your interest in literature, and maybe how those two backgrounds have helped come together to write this book.
So probably is apparent, but the moral argument is really Dave's passion, is really his vocation and his area of interest, and I've kind of come alongside him to support, and especially I think in this book to provide almost I want to say interpretation or translation to kind of the lay person. That was really our goal, our intention in this particular book. But we've been married almost 8 years now, and I have the English background. He has the philosophy background, and he had been working in this area, well before I met him. But after, hearing, just right from the very beginning, his passion for this comes out, and especially the real conviction about God's character, God's goodness. That was just so central. And although I have been a Christian, really all my life, I think that hearing from him these sort of new angles, new ways in, they've really, I want to say, reinvigorated my faith, reinvigorated my convictions about who God is, helped me better understand, really helped my own, I think, faith and understanding of what my relationship with God is and what he's calling me to be. And so I've kind of come at it from a different angle, but I think in my own way, I think I've actually been able to open up sort of his eyes to new applications and new sort of ways to explain it, ways to express it, especially with my English background. Kind of thinking about stories and how story can be such an expression of these truths, and add an imaginative component. And so that's sort of my contribution. I think it's really worked well. We do really collaborate well together. And so doing this book really was a joy, even though I don't add the philosophy, but I do think it sort of expands. This is very much a new work. It's not simply he does something, I do something. I think that interaction really kind of brings out a new thing, and it's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I could definitely pick up the element of story that is utilized throughout the book, where he explains some kind of philosophical concept, and then you illustrate it with some work, usually a work of fiction. Right. And but there were true stories in there as well from missionaries and so forth. But both do a great. I think I felt your touch at those points in particular, and I appreciated it.
Well, thank you. And of course, even the title, the morals of the story, we really tried to draw out that morality is much more than just a set of rules. It really is a story that we're being invited into. And so I think that kind of takes on a new element as well. Yeah.
And even the arrangement of the book is set up like a play.
Right.
And so I thought that was creative. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, that's a little bit of your role in the book. And then Dave, what kind of got you interested in the moral argument to begin with, and where you're part of the book, because you tie together different books that you've written, Good God and God and Cosmos, even the moral argument, a history. You kind of weave those together into one package in this book.
Right. Oh, but a funny story. Phil Allen recently said to me, he said, "I'm assuming all the charming parts of the book are from Mary Beth."
Not true.
Phil, rat. Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate philosophy major, I first became acquainted with the Euthyphro, the early Socratic dialogue, and then, of course, the Euthyphro dilemma that is embedded within that dialogue. And that raises this question about the relationship between justice and the gods, or, something like that. So I had the sense that there was a good solution to the Euthyphro dilemma, but I didn't think about it much more until I went to seminary. And then I wrote a paper for Jerry Walls, who would later become my important co-author and dear friend. But at seminary, I began to think more about that relationship between God and morality, and it was just one of those things that was sort of stuck in my craw. I'm not sure what or where the craw is, but it was stuck there. and so when I decided to get the Ph.D. in philosophy, I pretty much knew off the bat that I wanted to write on the Euthyphro dilemma, and then I did. at Wayne State under the tutelage of Bruce Russell, who was an excellent dissertation chair, even though he's an atheist. Then eventually the dissertation turned into a book. In answering the Euthyphro dilemma, I realized that what I was kind of groping for was something a little more robust than merely playing defense, defending a relationship between God and ethics against various Euthyphro-inspired objections. But I knew that was sort of a part of a broader discussion, and that broader discussion is essentially the moral argument, or perhaps more properly, a set of moral arguments for God's existence and goodness and the like. So so when the dissertation was turned into Good God, that was sort of the first salvo in that, and then we sort of extended the discussion with God and Cosmos, and now we've written a history of the moral argument, Jerry and I have, and we still plan to write a book defending moral realism against the rising tide of skeptics and that sort of thing. So all of these are pieces of a puzzle, as I see it. See, so Jerry and I were involved in this tetralogy, and we've done 3. We have 1 more to go, the 4th in the tetralogy. And then this book was written in between God and Cosmos and the history. Mm-hmm. So it was a bit of a break from the project that Jerry and I are doing, and we wanted to write something a little bit more popular. We wanted to extend and expand the readership of these ideas beyond, primarily practicing philosophers and graduate students. So we try to write it a little bit more accessibly. We try to make it a little bit more fun, use more humor, water down the concepts a little bit, just for the sake of a wider consumption. And we could have done a better job. I'm sure, you can pitch books at all kinds of levels, and some actually, the book's been criticized by some for being, too complicated, and then by others for being too simple.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. So it's just one of those things. But yeah, I mean, one of the beautiful aspects, it seems to me, of the moral argument is that you really can pitch it at just about every level imaginable. You can pitch it very, very rigorously to professional philosophers. You mentioned Terence. He does this really top-notch, world-class work in metaethics. And this is an important part of the moral apologetic enterprise. But you can also pitch the moral argument to first graders, at a very simple elemental level, because they already have this developing sense of right and wrong, and you can kind of get them thinking more reflectively about what that might indicate about the world, the nature of reality. And you can pitch it every level in between. So this book is pitched at a little bit more of an accessible level, and it really was an effort to draw in aspects of Good God and God and Cosmos, which had been written, as well as the history book that you mentioned, the history of the moral argument, that I had not yet written. Jerry and I hadn't yet produced. Mm-hmm. And so in this book, we've got chapters 3 and 4, real quick cursory summary, of the history. It's just a paragraph, usually on each of the major thinkers, or thereabouts. But in that more recent book on the history, it's fleshed out quite a bit more. And you have kind of 3 in 1 in this book here, and
it's meant to whet the appetite for others.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it does that really, really well. I know you mentioned the humor throughout. I don't know whose jokes those were, but they
were both of ours, and that's actually part of the collaboration too. When we look back through it, I remember when we're editing it, going back through, rereading it, the several times that you do. We actually forgot the origins of some of the jokes. We kind of forgot who started it, and there were times that maybe one person would share an idea, and then the other person would add to it, and it would sort of take its own form. It was a lot of fun to do. We really just enjoyed the sort of absurd humor, that kind of thing. So it was enjoyable for us, and hopefully it's enjoyable for readers too.
Yeah, it's always a good icebreaker into the chapter, and there were several times that I would I would listen to the book on my Kindle while I would be washing bottles for my baby, and I would hear the joke and laugh, and I'd pause and go and tell my wife, and she would be like, "Where are you getting these cheesy jokes?" But I thought they were funny, so I did enjoy that.
I want to say too. I mean, I know we had fun doing it, but it was definitely an intentional thing to be disarming, to not take ourselves seriously, but show that we were taking the ideas seriously. To just sort of remind maybe the reader and ourselves too, I think, of what really matters, our humanity, and sort of drawing people into relationships, and that this morality business is not meant to be dour. It's not meant to be oppressive. That it really is meant to provide a kind of an environment for life, for flourishing. And I think humor is very much a part of that flourishing. And so, yeah, it was kind of an intentional thing in that way.
Very good. So what I would tell people, and I'll pull myself up here so they can see me talking too. What I would tell people is my experience of this topic, at least, is I was introduced to the moral argument through the work of William Lane Craig. And it wasn't until this year that I learned about Dr. Baggett and his work on the moral argument. And what I didn't realize was that there's all these rich elements that, not that William Lane Craig doesn't know about them. Of course he knows about them. But his arguments focused on a specific thread, you could call it. And so I thought that was all there was to the moral argument. But it turns out there isn't just one argument. There's arguments, and there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of thinkers. So one of my favorite chapters in the whole book was on the history, where I didn't know about all these people. I didn't know about the different threads that they were looking at besides just values and duties that William Lane Craig focuses on. But what I found interesting was you all actually dedicated the book to Bill and Jan. So maybe you can just tell a little bit about that before we jump into the actual content of the book.
Sure. Well, yeah, I have tremendous respect for Bill Craig. He's such a great man and a great apologist. And the work he's done on the moral argument is wonderful. And I actually have some doctoral students right now writing on the moral argument and defending certain of his views, again in this arena against various objections. And yeah, he's just a terrific, absolutely terrific. Love him. But yeah, different folks are called to different things. I mean, of course, he's called to, do everything. He does all this world-class work in the cosmological argument and all these different areas. I don't have the intellectual bandwidth for all of that. I just focus on this one thing, the moral argument. But if you drill down into it, you discover, this world of riches. And it really is tremendously exciting. Yeah, Jerry and I were especially excited when we realized, almost to our chagrin, but we were kind of glad about it too, in another sense, that there hadn't been a comprehensive history written of the moral argument, and it's such a rich history with William Sorley and A.E. Taylor and John Henry Newman and H.P. Owen. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And then, of course, you have a whole bunch of guys more recently, just in the last few decades, when we've seen, I think, a real resurgence of interest in the moral argument. But when you look at the history of the argument, it is really a worthwhile thing to do for a number of reasons. But one of them, I think, is just sort of as an antidote to our contemporary tendency to be a little ahistorical, a little bit myopic, and a little bit, you might say, inordinately discursive in our apologetics. Okay, I'm going to give you this argument, a couple of premises and conclusion, and there it is. That's the argument, right there. What do you think? Disagree on pain of irrationality or stupidity. When you look at the history of the argument, what you see is something really very, very different. You see a number of fellows who gave Gifford lectures, in the Scottish universities on aspects of the moral argument, for example, and like A.E. Taylor and William Sorley, and you find that these guys were steeped in the argument. They kind of bathed in the argument. They lived and breathed it for not just a week or two or a month or a year, for decades, their whole careers. I mean, the apex of some of these guys' philosophical careers were these Gifford lectures, in which, they gave 20 lectures at a very deep level of fine-grained analysis on these important topics. And they had so much to say, so much to share. And then some of these works, they're just hardly read anymore. Mm-hmm. And people think, the moral argument, maybe Kant did a little bit of work on that, but mainly that's, C.S. Lewis, right? C.S. Lewis did all that, right? Or more contemporarily, is that a word? William Lane Craig or something. Yeah. But, all of these guys, I mean, they stood on the shoulders of giants, Mm-hmm. So A.E. Taylor's Faith of a Moralist, I mean, it is a classic. I mean, it's a bona fide classic, but who has read that? Some, but not nearly as many in the church as should, I think, at this point. So we need to rediscover that rich history. And in the process, I think, rediscover the value of living with this argument, not just seeing it as a sort of a tool or a weapon in our arsenal, to persuade, people, but to spend time appreciating the value of thinking about these issues at a deep level. We've yet to do the book Defending Moral Realism, and of course it's all in vogue among certain young postmodern types to say, how do I know torturing children is wrong? Okay, well, but look, how about you ask this question? How do I know that human beings have any more worth than a stone, mm-hmm. or a wave? Mm-hmm. We like the show, the Good Place. The Good Place, yeah.
I haven't watched it. I've heard of that.
Yeah, right. Just recently it ended, but in the final episode, at one point, there's this idea that a human being is just like a wave. It's just a form the water takes, and then it's gone, and that's cool. But something within us cries out against that and mm-hmm. says, no, that's not at all right. Intuitively, we know mm-hmm. there's something of infinite value and worth about every human being. We just know this. Now, if someone wants to say to me, well, I don't know it, I'm skeptical. It's like, well, okay, but I don't really think you are when you hear about the Holocaust and when you mm-hmm. hear about people losing their lives, innocence just being wiped out, and whatnot. I think there's something in you that viscerally cries out against that, and you know that it's wrong. You know that it's hideous, it's mm-hmm. atrocious, it's just absolutely reprehensible. Well, that intuition, that apprehension is the starting point for something like a moral argument, or potentially it could be, right? Mm-hmm. Something about which we're just sure, we're certain, like that, And I'm not talking about apodictic certainty and Cartesian certainty and all of that. Just set all that stuff aside. We have a deep sense of assurance. I mean, we're as sure of the value of human life as we are just about anything. So if someone says, well, give me an argument for it, I would say, well, look, it's just axiomatic. I mean, what am I more sure? What are we more sure of than it that I'm supposed to appeal to in order to convince you of the value of human life? If you don't see it, you just don't see it. I think most people see it. I think most who claim not to see it are just being disingenuous. That's my guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, but it's up to them. I mean, they have intellectual freedom to say whatever they want to say. The point is that the ingredients of the moral arguments are just about as sure as anything can be. And then what we try to do is encourage people to think really hard after having been attentive to such evidence. I mean, really closely attentive, and not just long enough in order to debunk it, and throw it out as if it's irrelevant. no, this is one of the most important truths as human beings that we can recognize. And once we do, right, having attended to the evidence in that sort of way, think really carefully about what's going to, provide the best explanation of that kind of infinite value that people possess that we intuitively recognize in that sort of visceral sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exciting stuff for me. I can't think of hardly anything more exciting to do in this life than to think about such matters as those.
Yeah, and I know in the book, you, before we jump into the content of it, you've teased me a few times in that. So before I jump into it, where you dedicated the book to Bill and Jan, you said that you went on a cruise with them. Mary Beth, did you go as well?
Yeah, we both did. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It was 2013.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and it actually went to Athens.
Yeah.
That sounds really neat. And I think you have. Well, Mary Beth, you can tell me. I've never gotten to meet Dr. Craig or his wife Jan, but I've heard wonderful, wonderful things about them. And even on his podcast, he's talked about the kind of like inspiration she's and this kind of moving force behind his work. Do you feel like maybe you do that for Dave, or Dave could even answer that?
Well, it's interesting. I thought you were going to be asking about the Craigs, and we were very much intentional to dedicate it to both of them because, and it's funny, I don't even know if we thought about this at the time, husband and wife writing the book and then dedicating it to a husband and wife, but we really do see them as a team, and probably because we've seen them in different situations, and it's just so apparent how they work so well together. Just seeing them complement one another. Very outgoing Jan is, and he's very kind of logical, but she sort of has this kind of motivating force, I think is what you had said. I don't know if you've ever heard him talk about that time in college, college where he was pursuing a degree, and she was seeing him finish all of his work like way before it was due, and she was thinking, well, either he's deluded himself or there's something extremely special about him. And obviously she realized it was the second, and really pushed him to go further, that this time really could be used in another way. And so I think that they just are such a wonderful team. And I do hope that David and I work that way together. I think that we do. But would be a real honor to say something that in that same way.
Something that I didn't know until I heard Dr. Craig say it, and then it made sense. Where he, I think for the longest time, has been unable to type his own
I didn't know that.
work. That Jan is the one that wrote his dissertation.
Oh, wow.
Jan is the one that's written. He has told her what to write, but she's the one that has typed these things out for him. And so she's gone through all of the work that he's done. And I wonder if have you been kind of the editor for Dave, where you've had to read through all these things?
That he does trust me as an editor, which I think David is one of those people who does not give a compliment freely, in terms of like the compliment is earned. So if he says that somebody is doing a good job in some way, he really believes it and really means it. And so he has said that about my editing of his work, that he does trust me and a few others to not kind of go behind and make sure. But he is also a wonderful editor in his own right in terms of editing my work. And I think that really speaks to, it's connected to the moral argument, to be honest with you, how we are not meant to be isolated, individual, autonomous. And I think that our partnership, and then of course, I think the community that we really tried to develop at the moralapologetics.com, our website, we've really tried to intentionally, again, inculcate community, recognizing that not one of us stands on our own, that it takes a village, kind of thing. It really does take. You cannot yourself see fully everything on your own. You really do need others. And so I think that we really to improve one another. I think it's been a real blessing that God put us together. And I've just seen so many ways that he's used us in our partnership.
Yeah, this reminds me of something, Jordan. So, when I looked into the history of the argument, what was really neat to see is that most of these fellows who had been trained and steeped in philosophy were also trained and steeped in history and in literature. A number of them, earned the Greats degree at Oxford, for example. So they knew literature along with philosophy, and of course they knew a bunch of different languages as well. It's really capacious minds at work. But a number of them, intentionally took time to talk about the value of something like literature. And we've been very intentional on the site to emphasize not just philosophy and theology and exegesis, but also the work of literary experts and bringing those insights to bear in our analysis, because the moral argument can be pushed from lots and lots of different angles, including literary ones, So when we're talking about, say, the value of human life, you can give a philosophical kind of consideration of some sort or other. But if you read an Auden poem, right, or you read a particular great novel that can move and touch you and capture your imagination, it can really speak to you much more viscerally, much more effectively, both cognitively and effectively, than can your typical discursive philosophical argument. So that's one of the things that she has helped me with, is to see that oftentimes there's a thinness to the philosophy unless you augment it with, say, the literary references to kind of augment the case. And then hand in hand, they really do a great deal of good work together.
Very good. All right. Well, I want to try and jump into some of the content of the book, and obviously along the way, Mary Beth, you add the story aspect. So if you remember or think on the spot of a story that's relevant to illustrate, by all means, do so. Right. But one of the things that I found really fascinating once I was introduced to your work, Dr. Baggett, was the different threads or features of morality that I hadn't really thought about before. So from William Lane Craig's work, I had only heard of what you talk about as moral ontology. So that's moral values and duties. So we can start there, and you can just explain a little bit about those. But the goal in all this was you laid out these certain facts of morality, these certain features that it has. And you mentioned a little while ago, you at the end, you say, so what's the best explanation of those features of reality? Does a worldview with God in it better explain those features than a worldview that doesn't try to reference him? And obviously the book is about a good God leading to a God that not only explains these things, but by explaining them, we see how good he is. So can you just explain what we mean by moral ontology and where that could be a good starting point to begin a conversation with people?
Sure. Yeah, so ontology is that branch of philosophy that deals with that which possesses existence, that which exists. So various moral facts obtain and are in need of explanation. Now, like you say, William Lane Craig, he talks about objective moral values and duties, and that's a good starting place. So objective moral values, objective moral duties or obligations, right? Values, then you can talk about in various ways. You can talk about what is good or best for human beings, or you could talk about, what, if anything, constitutes the ultimate good, or you could talk about the inadequacy of various secular goods, to satisfy us at our deepest levels. There's all kinds of ways in which to talk about that. Or you could talk about, say, the inherent intrinsic value of human beings, like was mentioned before. That's another kind of angle. and one that I often wish to emphasize myself, and one that Dr. Craig will often emphasize too in his work. So you've got those kinds of issues of goodness, which you said you talked to Matt at the end a little bit about God and goodness.
Yeah.
That's,
because he has a different kind of account than the one that Dr. Craig offers, and so that's something I was interested in.
Sure. No, that's very interesting. Oftentimes what I find, by the way, is the different accounts aren't necessarily inconsistent. If you listen to, say, a Thomist, and you listen to a divine command theorist, and you listen to a divine desire theorist, and whatnot, they all will often agree that in one sense or other, goodness is going to have its ultimate sort of foundation in God, but they might go about sort of explicating different features of it. Well, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They might just be different. Like you've got an insight from this angle, and this person has an insight from this other angle. So I'm often most interested not in the differences, or insofar as there are differences, to see the ways in which they supplement one another and can be built into something of a cumulative case. That's sort of an interest of mine. Well, anyway, so goodness. And then moral obligations. Now, again, there with moral obligations, right? So someone might be a divine command theorist, right? And say, well, that's the best way in which to account for the existence of these moral obligations. But again, that's a rather, in a sense, ancillary issue by comparison to the existence of moral obligations per se, right? And suppose you're convinced that in one way or another, again, these moral obligations are going to find their foundation in God. Well, divine command theory is one among potentially other ways in which to account for that dependence relation. We don't have to all agree to be divine command theorists, though, to give a moral argument for God's existence on the basis of moral obligations, right? Someone might be a natural law guy, a theistic natural lawyer, and also think that moral obligations give you some real good reasons to believe that God exists as the ultimate best explanation of such things. It's just a little bit more of a circuitous route that you might have to take. But what I find, again, interesting is what's central here and what's ancillary. What's central is that morality in its essential features depends upon God in some really crucial, central, ineliminable way, or at least is sort of a best explanation. By the way, there are other moral facts you can talk about beyond just moral values and duties, of course. You can talk about moral freedom, for example. So in my view, and this opens up, I know, a big can of worms, and but my view is, like, say if we're significantly determined or altogether determined creatures, it's difficult for me to understand the sense in which we would possess the requisite moral freedom to make decisions that are genuinely culpable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what I find it interesting that probably the majority of secular philosophers who are determinists, either hard determinists or soft determinists, will still say something like retributive justice just doesn't really make sense on a deterministic picture either way, because, we really could never do otherwise and all that sort of thing. And so they say, well, deterrence and rehabilitation are good things, but, that other thing of getting your just desserts, retributive justice, let's let that go the way of the dodo bird. Not really salvageable in our worldview. I personally think there's something honest about that. But I know that some theists agree, and they're theological determinists and all that. I don't want to get into all that right now. But as for me, I think that we have genuine moral freedom by which we can make culpable decisions and that sort of thing. I think intuitively we know this to be the case. And without such freedom, I think much of the bulwark of morality just comes tumbling down. I mean, I don't see how you can make sense of the enterprise without significant agency. But if we're, say, made in God's image or something like that, it's potentially going to be an excellent explanation of how it is that we were invested and imbued with this kind of significant moral freedom. You could also talk about moral rights, of course. This is another sort of salient moral fact. You remember the language of how we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights and all that sort of. This isn't a very popular view anymore, of course, anymore in our culture, in our context. but I think there were significant reasons to think that it's true. I remember Jeremy Bentham talking about the superstitious nature of inextirpable human rights. He thought, well, this is just silly. There's no principled reason to believe in any such things, Well, I think it is something you're hard pressed to believe in on principled grounds without the proper ontological foundations. Anyway, moral rights, moral freedoms, moral duties, moral goodness. These are all moral facts, and so you can expand the discussion beyond just values and duties if you're so inclined. Now, again, in fairness to Dr. Craig, he'll often go to college campuses, and he has 20 minutes to lay out the moral argument. Mm-hmm. So he'll usually give a deductive version, and he'll delimit it to those particular things. But he's flexible, in his last debate with Wielenberg, he gave an abductive argument instead of a deductive argument. So he gave a thoroughgoing best explanation account instead of sort of this sense of like the only explanation or something like that. So recently I had the thought you can kind of graph this, right? Think of like an X and Y axis, right? So think of like the depth of explanation, like how far you drill down. That's say the Y-axis, and then the X-axis is how many things that you're actually looking at that you're trying to explain. You might just say, well, let's just do a moral obligation, moral argument for God's existence, like Planck suggests. Mm-hmm. And he thinks, by the way, this is the best argument you can come up with in natural theology, an obligation-centric moral argument for God's existence. Well, in which case, then you would just, go one notch over. Okay, you're just talking about those things, and then you want to drill down, and depending on the degree to which you drill down, you can almost pictorially represent it on a graph. But you might want to say, well, let's talk about 10 different things that you want to talk about here and try to explain various moral phenomena. And then depending on the depth to which you analyze, what constitutes the best explanation, you can fill out the corresponding graph. So for the mathematically inclined in our audience, they can actually sort of pictorially represent it. If Sloan Lee's listening, he'd be all about it.
I've seen Sloan on Facebook. But
he's a dear friend of mine. He's someone I'm looking forward to seeing soon.
I think you had thought about that graph in relation to the history of the moral argument, because there's so many different variations, and it might be a way to visually, represent, kind of, that might be an interesting way to go through the history of the moral argument book and kind of, again, sort of, plot people on a graph, just to see.
One thing I'll pause here before we move on to moral epistemology. There was a story in the book, and I had never heard of this before, but I thought it was tragic and humorous and memorable. And that was that somebody that wants to deny these values, kinds of obligations, and so forth, really doesn't have a leg to stand on. That was like the punchline in the book. Can you give that little summarize that little story?
I was thinking about bringing it up when you were talking earlier about that sort of denial. On one hand, people might say rationally, just I deny this isn't true. This world is meaningless, and it's just whatever meaning we impose on it. I don't know if you've ever read any Flannery O'Connor, but she is such an amazing Christian fiction writer. She wrote mostly short stories, though she did have a couple of novels. But This Good Country People is one of her short stories, and it is. It is very powerful. Just really, it's just very stark in the world that she creates in terms of the characters. The main character, Helga, is the character's name. She's actually chosen this name. Joy was her given name at birth, but she's chosen this ugly, hideous name intentionally because she thinks it captures something about the nature of this world. And but it's very performative almost. She has an accident as a child. She's lost her leg. I think it was a hunting accident. I can't remember the specific details, but so she's really had a very hard life, and she's kind of embraced that, and basically again just decided, well, life is meaningless. And she's very intelligent. She's actually earned her Ph.D. in philosophy, but she's still living at home. She's kind of emotionally stunted, and yet, has this kind of rational projection almost of what she thinks that the world is. And so she rants and raves and, really, again, rejects the idea that there are standards of right and wrong, and really embraces this. Well, she actually finds herself in this position where she's made herself vulnerable to another person, this potential romantic relationship. And she actually kind of does it because she thinks the person that she's involved with is actually kind of a gullible person. He's a Bible salesman, and she thinks, oh, this person is just completely naive. Well, the tables actually get completely turned on her. And I don't think, I might be kind of giving away the ending, but even with my telling you, anybody who would read the story, I think you said it was like a sucker punch to your soul when he read it. It's almost impossible for her at that point, when she's again made herself vulnerable to this person, and he basically reveals who he is, that he isn't what he's presented himself to be, and he completely takes advantage of her and does take her wooden leg. That's part of it's a lot of really, again, grotesque imagery is kind of what's associated with Flannery O'Connor, and it just it puts very starkly, is this a world that you really believe you live in? Because at the end she's saying, the character who has said there is no such thing as morality, as right and wrong, she's appealing to the person who has presented himself as a Christian of, you're a Christian, you're a good person, you're not supposed to do this. And he says basically presents her philosophy back to her. And what can you do? But I mean, again, it is kind of a sucker punch to the soul, because it basically puts it very plainly. Again, do you really believe this? What kind of world results from this? And what kind of world would this be to live in? It's extremely powerful. I strongly encourage people to read it, but be aware of what you're kind of getting into. There's a piece actually on moral apologetics that I had done on Good Country People, where it lays it out a little bit more too.
Oh, okay. I didn't know about that. You've written on it.
You might check that out.
That would be good.
Thank you to share that.
Yeah. That story was like good in many ways, because you made the punchline memorable about you don't have a leg to stand on. But I think Flannery O'Connor does it's just a good picture of what a moral nihilist is saddled with, basically. The kind of world that it looks like they're endorsing. But I think as a reader, you can't help but have, like you said, it's like a sucker punch. Like, you just feel this anger well up inside of you, like, I can't believe that he would do that. That's so wrong. And then the second you say that's so wrong, he deserves blah blah blah,
like that, putting it right, really getting to the heart of the matter, and really putting it very starkly is the word that keeps coming to my mind, in the reader's face.
Jordan, Dr. Craig will often say in your apologetics conversations, gently try to enable your interlocutor to see how steep a price they have to pay to stick with the worldview they espouse. And this is a great example of it.
Yeah. And at the end, I want to try and come back and maybe show some of the differences in your approach as compared to the deductive approach that, not that Craig always uses, because you pointed out he uses abductive, at least in the case of the debate with Wielenberg. But because there is some, I'm in agreement with you. It seems like there's some risk involved, maybe when you take the deductive route, where people are pressured to give up belief in the moral facts rather than their naturalism. So we can talk about that at the end too, but I just at this point, I think it's helpful to know what we're talking about when we talk about moral ontology. And do you in the book you talk about how like human value, for example, it seems like human value is more or less assumed as an axiom in other secular ethical theories. Maybe not all of them, but a couple you mentioned in the book is I think utilitarianism. When we or I'm sorry, utilitarianism actually, it seems, doesn't have human value as its in its focus. Really, it almost does away with it. It says you can do anything to humans as long as it brings about these good consequences later. But you can expand on that.
Yeah. Well, there are some Christians who are drawn to utilitarianism and certain of its aspects. So it's not necessarily wedded to a sort of a secular perspective. If someone, for example, as a Christian, feels like we have essential equality because God's imbued us with that and has made all of us in His image, and there's an essential equality there, that actually underwrites one of the important principles of utilitarianism, which just assumes that we ought to treat people equally, right? And that sort of thing. Of course, it can lead to consequences like, or results like, well, this person needs to be sacrificed to save all these others, even though that person is innocent, and it seems unjust, and it seems like it would be a violation of their essential rights and all that sort of. And that's why, among other reasons, I don't subscribe to it myself. Which isn't to say, though, that consequences are unimportant. It's just that utilitarianism doesn't have a corner on the market of the consideration of consequences. But yeah, when it comes to something like intrinsic human value, I don't think that particular normative ethical theory is going to give us deep and satisfying an answer, as can theism generally, or Anselmian theism generally, and Christianity particularly. By the way, I think there's some really cutting-edge work to be done on the moral argument in extending the case beyond, you might say, generic theism or even Anselmian theism or classical theism, all the way to Christian theism. Work on the Imago Dei, work on implications of Trinitarianism, and other dimensions of distinctively Christian theology can really be brought to bear, I think, in extending the moral argument in various of its features and aspects, all the way to a point of recognizing that the deliverances of special revelation in Christianity can flesh out the picture in a very important sort of way. John Henry Newman, who's a luminary in the history of the moral argument, had that view that this was sort of the relationship between general and special revelation, right? Generally, the moral argument, at least as I've been putting it forth, is predicated on general revelation. But then, you read something like the New Testament, and he said it can perform a kind of ampliative function where you flesh out these details even more. You give a yet more fine-grained analysis of what's going on here. And so when you see that we've been made in God's image, in God's the image of a Trinitarian God, and imbued with eternal significance because of this, well, it makes sense of what may well be something of a deliverance of general revelation, that there is a kind of essential equality. Even a lot of secularists can recognize that. Of course, there's a long history of the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition that helps explain it sociologically. But to whatever extent they're able to apprehend it in terms of the general revelation, the special revelation can extend the analysis even more. I encourage many of my students to think about that, and some of them have taken me up on the offer, to extend aspects of the moral argument all the way to Christianity. So that's an exciting prospect. Just wanted to interject that.
Yeah. In the description of this video, I described that in the book, that the way you've made your abductive version, and we'll talk about this in detail too, especially once you begin to incorporate Kantian moral faith, so moral an argument from grace, essentially, and an argument from providence. Those begin to look distinctively Christian, and that was completely new, and so I want to get to that in just a second. But let's go ahead and shift to another feature of morality, that we're very well acquainted with, perhaps maybe more well acquainted with than anything else, and that's our moral knowledge, moral epistemology. So what is that when we talk about moral epistemology or moral knowledge?
Yeah, so here we have the issue of not just what are the facts of the matter, but how is it that we come to possess knowledge of these facts, right? So yeah, in the book we talked about, with a standard kind of justified true belief model of knowledge. It's got to be augmented in various ways to, circumvent Gettier challenges, all that business. But then we shift gears and we talk about some of the distinctive challenges I think that our naturalist friends face in accounting for moral knowledge. And a big discussion in the literature nowadays is the evolutionary debunking argument. So it's basically this challenge that if we are the products of this unguided process of evolution, then we don't necessarily have good principled reasons to believe that our ethical convictions track moral truth. And I actually do think that these debunking objections are a highly effective argument against moral knowledge on naturalism. But then on theism, where the process is not an unguided one, and God can be actively involved in directing the process in various ways, that you can circumvent these challenges that come from debunking. But Angus Manouge gives a neat little succinct summary of this kind of challenge to what he called evolutionary ethics. And he says, you can construe it either in a strong sense or a weak sense. And again, predicated on Darwin's own assumption that evolution could have gone differently, right? Could have ended up going in a different direction. And we could have ended up with different moral convictions from the ones that we have now. On the strong evolutionary ethical perspective, the moral truths themselves, the facts of the matter themselves, would have been different, right? In which case you have a defeater for our moral knowledge. But on weak evolutionary ethics, the truths would have been the same, but our beliefs would have been different, right? It would have been different moral psychology that would have been the result. And again, you have a defeater for moral knowledge in either case, right? If you've got two options and they both end up in the same place, the idea is in either case you end up with something of a defeater for moral knowledge. That's real succinct. And there's a lot of great work to be done here. By the way, I would throw in the culprit is not necessarily evolution. It's the unguided aspect of it. The unguided aspect of it. And there's some really cutting edge work to be done, I think, in that area. And it's work that I want to do some additional work on myself. Sorry for the redundancy there.
No.
If you look into the literature, I mean, it's just this burgeoning field of literature on this topic, and it's just fascinating. And we need more top-notch Christian philosophers who are ethicists to do the really rigorous work in this area of exploring these debunking objections and defending a theistic picture against those objections, because I really think that we're not the ones who are vulnerable to it. It's our materialist and naturalist friends who are.
Yeah, I intend to do an interview specifically on moral knowledge. I had thought about getting Angus Manouge. I'd asked Paul Copan who would be good to get on for moral knowledge, and he said, "Why don't you contact David Baggett?" And I said, "Well, I'm already going to be interviewing him. He may not want me to interview him more than once."
Well, Angus Ritchie would be good, and of course the other Angus too. On our website one time I pointed out the slight differences between their two epistemic arguments, and I called the piece "Battle of the Angai." They don't actually end up disagreeing very much. They're both great guys, and they both do great work. But yeah, either one of them would be terrific.
I will.
Mark Linville too. Mark Linville's awesome on the.
Paul Copan told me he was. Maybe this was in the past, because they were going to write for the Bloomsbury series, The Moral Argument, and that book was on Amazon, and I came across it, and it said unavailable. So I contacted Dr. Copan and I said, hey, how can I get on this book? Because this looks like it would be a fantastic book. He said, well, it never actually got written because Mark Linville got so sick and he was having difficulty with his family. I think maybe medical things. Is he well enough now to do an interview with, you think?
Yeah, I think it was his wife went through a health scare, more so than him. But yeah, definitely contact Mark. He is brilliant. I keep telling him that he's the guy to write the best book on the moral argument that's yet to be written. And so we'll see if that happens. I know he's capable of it.
I will try to contact him then. Okay, so here was the next feature of the book that was all new to me. I was, a little bit. I was definitely familiar with values and duties, and even moral freedom to an extent. I was familiar with an argument for moral knowledge. Kind of runs like an evolutionary argument against naturalism, but just kind of focused more on the knowledge of morality. But something that was completely new was what you all call Kantian moral faith, and so can you just explain what Kantian moral faith is referring to?
Sure, and here the inspiration is largely Kant originally, and then John Hare's work on this topic. John Hare is a wonderful philosopher, of course, the son of R.M. Hare. The Christian, taught at Calvin, and then was it Lehigh? Yeah. And now Yale. Yeah. Wonderful philosopher, and his book, The Moral Gap, I'm thinking in particular here. Well, in that book, he gives versions of both aspects of Kantian moral faith. So one has to do with this issue of, is there ultimate correspondence between, say, happiness and virtue? And the idea is the enterprise of morality itself, to retain its stability, needs to feature an ultimate airtight correspondence between these things, or otherwise there could be an essential disconnect at the end of the day between what morality says and what rationality says. So there's this idea of, is it the case that to be a person of virtue really will ultimately be to your best interest? And interestingly enough, again, it goes back to Kant, and you would think, of all people, Kant, he was the one who said the consequences don't matter. But don't forget, he also said that ultimately it's a perfectly legitimate question, even though it shouldn't motivate us. We should be motivated by concern for the moral law alone, but still, we're not just noumenal creatures, we're also these phenomenal creatures, and we can't help psychologically but to care about our happiness. And to be a fully rational enterprise, morality has to feature that kind of ultimate correspondence or coherence between happiness and virtue. Just our being the kinds of beings that we are, right? So it actually does go back, of all people, to Kant. And so when people treat the Kantian dictum to do morality for morality's sake as if we should have no regard or concern at all about our well-being, that's actually not so much in a Kantian spirit as a bastardized Kantian spirit, it seems to me. Anyway, the other aspect of Kantian moral faith is morality possible? We have to believe that it's possible, or else it's just irrational, to think that we have an obligation to do something which is flat impossible, beyond our reach. Well, the interesting thing is that the kind of moral faith that we need to believe that morality is achievable has to be affected within a context in which we realize that we can't really live up to the moral law. We invariably fall short in ever so many ways. Now, if ought implies can, how is it that we are obligated to do morality if it's beyond our reach? We could always do better, right? Mm-hmm. So, any kind of realistic hope for, fulfilling the moral law, the idea is we're going to have to get some help. There's a gap that results. That's how John Hare puts it, between the best we can do and what morality requires. So this aspect of moral faith involves trust that somehow the gap can be closed. Mm-hmm. Secular ways in which to close the gap are to lower the standard, or to exaggerate our capacities, or to come up with some sort of secular counterfeit for divine grace. And what Hare argues extensively in his book is that none of those really work as well as the traditional Christian teaching that by God's grace we can be not just forgiven, and that's the first step. We have to be forgiven. You have to make sense of that. And then we can be actually transformed, and we can actually hold out the realistic, ultimate, principled hope of achieving something like moral perfection by God's grace. Of course, this is just standard Christian teaching. But yeah, we have this sort of intuitive sense within us that we're meant for something like that, but we also palpably recognize our inability to do it on our own. And so what can close the gap? What's the best explanation that the gap can be closed in an effective fashion? Something like the divine grace of God, by which we can be transformed into the sort of people we were made to be in the first place. Anyway, these two ideas, the providential idea of God orchestrating things in such a way as to make cohere happiness and holiness, and the performative the transformative issue or performative issue of can we actually be holy? Can we actually achieve morality and become the people we were meant to be? Two aspects of Kantian moral faith. The idea is that as these are essential features to morality, what it simply takes on our part is attentiveness to this evidence and then sort of seeing where that evidence leads. And you think about it enough and you realize, wow, the theistic picture makes sense of these aspects of morality a whole lot better than anything that our secular friends can provide. And I would suggest anything that our non-Christian religious friends can provide.
That's what I was going to say. It seems to be a distinctively Christian feature, grace. That is a very defining characteristic of Christianity as opposed to other religions that incorporate a kind of you have to work to some degree for your salvation, and that's just so discouraging to me because that it seems like repeatedly just reflect on your own experience. It seems repeatedly whatever law, whatever rule book you either hold for yourself or others hold you up to, it seems like you just repeatedly fail at it. Even if you meet the standard externally, your motivations are often impure, and you just don't cut it on your own. And so this argument seems it's actually got a beautiful element to it in that we see our brokenness, we acknowledge it, we don't try to downplay it, and we acknowledge our need for divine grace, and that seems most fully captured in the ministry of Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's another way in which the moral argument serves as the perfect prelude or prolegomenon to proclamation of the good news of the gospel.
Yeah. And I want to return real quick to providence before we start to wrap up, and I'll take a few questions from people. So before I'll say this, and then there was one more thing I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll take questions. Can you give an example? Because I think this was coming up too with maybe Matthew Flanagan mentioned it last or when I interviewed him. Can you give an example of where a person would have a choice between why should I do what's morally right? Why would I need to do that? And they're faced with they could be happy, or they could do what's right, and the question is, well, which one, and how that argument would enter into the picture at that point and resolve that conflict for that person.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, your worldview is relevant here, right? Because you have this intuitive sense that you shouldn't depart from, say, the moral law. But you might find yourself in a situation, right? And we all find ourselves in this situation sometimes when we're tempted, right? To think, yeah, but if I did this, it would be morally wrong, but it would give me the pleasure that I want, or it would give me the happiness that I want, or the fulfillment that I want, or something like that. So it really comes down to, is morality, woven into reality or not? On a naturalistic picture, it seems to me, you're probably going to be hard-pressed to make the case that it is. And there are going to be invariably those moments where you're convinced, on principled grounds, that there is a disconnect between what rationality is declaring and what morality is declaring. At the same time, though, you have this deep-seated conviction that morality is a fully rational enterprise, right? It's axiomatic. And so if you follow that out and you think, okay, well, then something's got to give here. I'm a naturalist. On naturalism, there are invariable disconnects between morality and rationality. But I'm convinced that ultimately there are no such disconnects. So much the worse for naturalism. Mm-hmm. This is the basic idea here. So it really drives you to ask fundamental worldview questions about the extent to which reality itself is committed to morality.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just mention, too, we had talked about the good place earlier, and David and I have done a piece on this together. Again, it's at Moral Apologetics, and it really hits exactly right there. It's such an interesting show. I don't know. I know you mentioned that you had heard of it, but it centers on questions of morality. I mean, it really is this idea of the good place. It's this kind of secular version of heaven, and it really does kind of explore questions of ethics and right and wrong and our eternal destinations and things like that. But it is intentionally secular. I mean, it embraces secular. It never brings up God except as maybe a punchline or something like that. And you see it play out. Again, this is another example of like kind of a cultural phenomenon or a story where you have kind of an imaginative exploration of an idea, and you can kind of just see how paltry it is, how many lamentable features there are because it doesn't have, in this case, in this particular situation, it doesn't have an administrator who is benevolent, who is all powerful, who can bring together holiness and happiness, who can make those two things align. And so, yeah, I think this is just another kind of way in which a story can, in a negative way, I suppose, reflect or reveal that there probably should be something else. Don't we wish that there were something else?
So I'm curious, in the show, do the characters face these kinds of situations where it looks like there's this disconnect between holiness and happicness?
Yes, and they often embrace almost a stoicism. I'm probably using that word in the kind of colloquial sense and not a philosophically rigorous sense, but very much I'm going to be committed to right no matter what happens. There's this one scene where one of the main character says that she's going to embrace the pandemonium, embrace sort of the irrationality that is this world that she finds herself in, and kind of do the right thing regardless. But what does right mean if it's not, again, embedded in reality itself? So it does really reveal this disconnect, and the only answer they have is to again, kind of a self-assertion of this is right, this is good, and I don't care if it results in an unhappiness. I'm going to do it regardless.
Yeah, one of the things that we argue in our piece is that notion of the propriety of doing right for right's sake makes best sense in a world in which there is benevolent administration, where there is what Thomas Reid called this coincidence thesis. The correspondence between happiness and holiness, which solves what Sidgwick called the dualism of practical reason, this disconnect issue that people have recognized in the literature through the centuries. And theism provides an impeccable solution to it. We think that's deeply evidential. Of course, people are at liberty to disagree, but we find that to be evidentially significant.
Mm-hmm. Well, so those were the 5 features that you went through the book. You talked about moral ontology, so that's values and duties. Well, you kind of separated those in the book, though. So it was values was one, and duties was another, and then moral knowledge was a third, and then you had the 2 elements of Kantian moral faith. So you had moral transformation, this what John Hare calls the moral gap. And that argument from our recognition that we can't live up to this standard, yet we feel we're obligated to try, at least, to live up to the standard. But that seems absurd because if you're telling me I ought to do something, that means I can do it, but I can't do it. So, and that's where an external factor comes in. By God's grace, I can do this, even if not in this life. I'm being conformed to the image of Christ, and I'll be holy as He is holy, at least in the life to come. But and then the fifth element was moral providence, and God, like you're saying right now, orchestrating the things so that holiness and happiness ultimately converge, and we can trust we should do the right no matter what, and we know they'll eventually find their convergence. So those were the 5 elements in the book, and none of those, I really appreciated this, you all talked about, none of them are meant to be a conversation stopper in the sense of, I just laid out the facts and beat you over the head with them. Now, like you said, on pain of irrationality, surrender your naturalism and come over here to this camp. It's not meant to be like a combative kind of thing. It's more invitational and says, bring, we can all agree to these facts about moral transformation, and like we think that these things will have convergence, and so forth. We can agree on human value and these duties and so forth. And we just want to try and team up, really, and look at what would best satisfy or best explain all of them. And it's a team effort, not meant to be my group versus your group kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I appreciated all that.
Yeah, and by the way, another element of the team effort that's called for is by approaching things the way we are in terms of what constitutes the best explanation, the challenge there is you've got to take on all the comers, right? And there's a lot of alternate rival theories out there. And that's a much bigger job than any one person could do, or any two. This is really a job for a community. And so zero in and do your work. I have a grad student, TJ Gentry, dear friend, who's working on the moral argument and Mormonism, to sort of convince the Mormons that classical Christianity is going to provide the better explanation of these various moral realities and things like that. So there's lots and lots of exciting work to be done, I think, in this area in years to come.
Yeah. Well, one last thing, and I'll tell the audience, if you do have a question for Mary Beth or Dave, go ahead and write those in the live chat right now, because I've only got one more thing I'm going to ask, and then we'll wrap this up. And that is, I said I would return to it at the end. You give an abductive version of the moral argument. William Lane Craig typically offers a deductive version. So there's some differences that I think you highlight in the book with the acronym CARBS. And you say carbs aren't good for anyone. So what are the differences between the abductive version and the deductive version that you think is important to at least recognize and perhaps play a role in which version you offer on which occasion?
Yes, right. Yeah, right. So if anyone who's listening is not familiar with this distinction, in a deductive argument, the premises aim to logically guarantee the conclusion. So it's airtight case. And then in abduction, not unlike induction in this regard, the premises are not going to guarantee the conclusion, but just make it, if it's an explanation that's being proffered, potentially the best explanation, and it's something to which we can at least somewhat tentatively infer to. All right. So is there an airtight case or less than airtight case? We suggest less than airtight case, but still a strong case, especially if you take, say, these 4 or 5 dimensions that we talk about and you build an internal cumulative case. I think you end up with a very, very strong, moral argument. And there are some challenges associated with a deductive approach. Now, if your time is limited, and you've got 15, 20 minutes to lay it out, the abductive case is probably going to be difficult and challenging to fit into that time frame, and maybe you want to go with a deductive approach. But just be aware that there are some potential challenges associated with it. I'll just mention one significant one that leaps to my mind. So consider the premise that Craig uses. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. And then, of course, he says, but they do exist, so God exists. Okay. Notice Toland's, it works, it's beautiful. Premise follows with logical certainty with the premises, and then the question becomes, are the premises true? And you have that conversation. Well, let's zero in on the one premise. So if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. Well, as an Anselmian theist, William Lane Craig himself and I and others would say that is actually a counterfactual that we're considering, right? And in fact, it's a counter-essential. It's a counter-essential. So consider the world in which God doesn't exist. What kind of world is that like? Well, if we're right, such a world is something like a null world, right? It's not just, say, this world and on the assumption God doesn't exist, right? It's like a null world. So I kind of think it's true, but not in the sense in which most people will understand it. Most people are going to understand it in these terms. Okay, well, let's assume that a world like this can exist without God. Well, then I want to say, if a world like this can exist without God, do we actually have good reasons to think that morality couldn't exist in a world like this? I'm not so sure. As an Anselmian theist, I think we have good principled reasons to believe that a world like this couldn't exist without God. So think about the richness of this world, how rich and robust it is, if we're right as Christian theists, right? It was made by God, and it's inhabited with creatures with intrinsic value and eternal worth, made in his image, made in the image of an essentially loving God, who's Trinitarian in nature. Okay. What you're essentially saying then is to your atheist friend is, okay, I'll give you all of that, essentially. Now knock yourself out and do what you can to make sense of morality in this world. You can't do jack squat. And I'm inclined to say, actually, they'd be able to do a whole lot.
Yeah.
They got a lot to work with. If we're right, they only have all this stuff to work with because the world is the way it is because God made it, and it's rich, and there are satisfactions of morality, and there are, dictates of conscience, and there are all manner of aesthetic and relational dynamics at play of which we're aware as believers and unbelievers alike. It's quite a world. If this kind of thing could just pop into existence on its own, I'm not entirely convinced morality itself couldn't. I think it's barking up the wrong tree. And what are you really trying to convince them anyway of? Like, okay, in a world just like this, if God didn't exist, you could rape your grandmother and it wouldn't matter. I mean, what in the world are we saying? Right. It's just crazy. So why don't we instead start with the common ground and say, look, unless they've gone over to skepticism, and then we have to have another conversation. And you say, look, you and I both think there's some things that are right and some things that are wrong, right? Cancellation of Firefly, obviously wrong. So let's explore that question and ask, again, being attentive to that evidence, what do we really mean by wrong? What do we really mean by saying there are objective, moral, binding, authoritative duties that we should obey, that human beings have intrinsic eternal value and so forth? Let's really look carefully at this evidence and ask, what's going to provide the best explanation? That we're just collocations of atoms and molecules ultimately at the end of the day, or that we have been created by a loving God that explains why love is down at the center of things, that explains why love is intuitively as important as we know it to be. And then you make that case and you take your time and you build it and you let the evidence work on folks over time. You don't insist that they be immediately convinced right then. Let this evidence work on them. Let them sit with the argument. Let them live with the argument. And we should do so ourselves. It's good for our souls, I think, to think about these moral realities that are so central to the human condition. And I think so central to the meaning of life. Think about them. Be attentive to the evidence. Let them sink in. Let them do their work. And I think over time you will find that many people will find themselves persuaded by the evidence. And there's a track record of this. I mean, Al Plantinga says he thinks this is the best argument in the arena of natural theology. William Lane Craig has said when he goes to college campuses, it's the moral argument that's the most effective at persuading his listeners, even though the cosmological argument is his favorite argument. He admits this. It has an established track record of being effective. It has an established track record of serving as the perfect prolegomenon to the proclamation of the good news of the gospel. I think it's a wonderful set of arguments and considerations that it would do us all great good to ponder.
Excellent. All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I don't have a question from the live chat. So just a reminder again, Thursday I have a interview with Dr. Liz Jackson, Wagering against Divine Hiddenness. Tune in then. It should be at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As soon as this video ends, you can see it. It'll be the next in the live or upcoming live events. So we look forward to it then. If you all will just hang around for like 1 or 2 minutes after we get off, I can say my goodbyes to you. But to everyone else, thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon. And follow their work at moralapologetics.com. The link is in this description. You just right now go ahead and just click that link in the description. You won't regret it. See you all.